The alarm rang at 4:10 in the morning, long before the sky began to lighten. The small apartment was quiet except for that sharp sound and the soft hum of an old refrigerator in the corner of the kitchen. Adrian Cole opened his eyes slowly. For a moment he stared at the ceiling, trying to remember what day it was. But then the tired feeling in his body reminded him it didn't matter what day it was. Every day looked almost the same. He pushed the thin blanket aside and sat up. His muscles ached, especially his shoulders and back. The soreness never really went away anymore. It only moved around from place to place, depending on what job he had worked the night before. Adrian stood, stretched his arms, and walked to the small sink. The mirror above it had a crack across the bottom corner. His face looked older than his age. Dark circles sat under his eyes, and there were small lines forming around his mouth. Another day, he whispered quietly to himself. He splashed cold water on his face and got dressed in the dim light. His first job started at 5 in the morning at a small auto repair shop across town. It didn't pay much, but the owner trusted him and always gave him extra hours when work was busy. Adrian grabbed a piece of dry toast from the counter and stepped outside. The air was cold and quiet. Most people were still asleep while he walked down the empty street toward the bus stop. The sky was dark blue, and a few streetlights flickered as he passed. 2 years earlier, his life had been completely different. Back then, he had shared a house with his wife. They had plans, dreams, and the simple hope of building a stable life together. Adrian had always believed that if he worked hard enough, things would eventually work out. But life doesn't always move in straight lines. The marriage slowly broke apart. Arguments became more frequent. Money problems grew worse, and trust slowly disappeared. When the divorce finally happened, Adrian felt like the ground had been pulled from under his feet. The hardest part wasn't the silence of the empty house. It was the paperwork that came afterward. Bills began appearing that Adrian had never seen before. Credit cards, loans, and unpaid balances connected to accounts with his name on them. At first, he thought it had to be some kind of mistake, but the numbers kept growing. The total amount was more than he had ever earned in a year. Many people told him the same thing. Just walk away, one friend said. File bankruptcy and start fresh. But Adrian couldn't bring himself to do it. His father had once told him something when he was younger. Your name is the one thing nobody should ever be able to take from you. Those words stayed in his mind. So Adrian made a decision that most people didn't understand. Instead of running from the debt, he decided he would pay it. That decision changed his entire life. The bus arrived with a loud sigh of brakes. Adrian climbed inside and sat near the window. A few other early workers sat scattered around the seats, all looking just as tired as he felt. 30 minutes later, he stepped off near the repair shop. The building was small, with faded paint and a big garage door that squeaked every time it opened. The smell of oil and metal filled the air the moment Adrian walked inside. The shop owner, an older man named Mr. Calder, was already there drinking coffee. You're early again, the man said with a small smile. Adrian shrugged. Couldn't sleep much. Mr. Calder studied him for a moment. He had watched Adrian slowly push himself harder and harder over the past 2 years. You working tonight again? He asked. Yeah, Adrian answered. Cleaning offices after 9. Mr. Calder shook his head slowly but didn't argue. He had already tried many times to convince Adrian to slow down. Work started quickly. Cars rolled in one after another. Adrian changed oil, replaced brakes, fixed engines, and carried heavy toolboxes across the garage floor. By the time the clock reached noon, his hands were already covered in grease. But his day wasn't even halfway finished. After leaving the repair shop, Adrian walked 2 blocks to a small sandwich place where he worked the afternoon shift delivering food orders around the city. It wasn't glamorous work, but tips helped him chip away at the growing pile of bills. The manager handed him a stack of delivery bags. Busy day, she said. Adrian nodded and headed back out. Traffic moved slowly as he drove from office buildings to apartment complexes. Some customers were friendly. Others barely looked at him while taking their food. By late afternoon, his phone buzzed with reminders of upcoming payments. He never ignored them. Every dollar he earned had a destination. Credit cards, loan companies, medical bills he didn't even remember agreeing to. Sometimes the numbers made his head spin, but he kept going, because stopping would mean everything he had worked for would collapse. Around 6 in the evening, Adrian grabbed a cheap meal from a grocery store and sat on a bench outside. For 10 minutes, he allowed himself to rest. People walked past laughing, talking on their phones, heading home to dinner. Adrian watched quietly. He wasn't jealous, just tired. His evening job started at 7 inside the same grocery store where he had bought his dinner. He worked in the storage area stacking boxes and refilling shelves. The bright store lights made his eyes sting after a long day. Still, he kept moving, box after box, hour after hour. When most workers clocked out and went home, Adrian stayed longer because he still had 2 more jobs waiting. At 9:30, he drove across town to an office building where he worked with a small night cleaning crew. They vacuumed floors, wiped desks, and emptied trash bins while the city slept. The work was quiet, almost peaceful sometimes. But Adrian's body felt heavier with every step. Near midnight, he finally finished. Most people would collapse into bed after a day like that. Adrian couldn't. His final job was on weekends and some late nights helping a small construction team unload materials. Tonight, they were expecting a delivery truck. So Adrian drove straight there. The large truck arrived around 12:30 in the morning. The men worked together, lifting wooden boards and metal beams from the back of the trailer. Adrian's hand shook slightly from exhaustion, but he refused to slow down. One of the workers looked at him and laughed softly. "Man, you work like 5 different lives," the guy said. Adrian smiled faintly. Something like that. By the time the truck was empty, the sky was beginning to lighten again. Adrian checked his phone. 3 hours before the alarm would ring again. He finally drove home through quiet streets. Inside his apartment, the silence felt heavier than usual. He sat at the small kitchen table and opened a folder filled with papers. Bills were neatly organized by date. Every payment he made was carefully recorded. The total amount had dropped slowly over the last 2 years, but the mountain still stood tall. Adrian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Sometimes he wondered how long a person could keep going like this. But every time that thought appeared, he pushed it away, because quitting would mean everything he had sacrificed would mean nothing. And Adrian Cole had never been the kind of man who quit, even if it meant working 5 jobs, even if it meant living on almost nothing, even if it meant carrying a burden that most people would have walked away from. He looked at the stack of payment receipts one more time before placing them back in the folder. Then he stood up, walked to his bed, and set the alarm again. For 10 a.m., the same time as always. Before turning off the light, Adrian whispered quietly into the empty room, "Just keep going." Within minutes, he fell asleep. Outside, the city slowly woke up, unaware that somewhere inside a small apartment, a man was pushing himself past every limit simply to keep a promise he had made to himself. And he still had no idea that the person he was sacrificing everything for was telling a very different story about him. The weeks continued to pass, and Adrian's life moved in the same tight circle of work, sleep, and more work. Most mornings began before the sun rose, and most nights ended long after the city had gone quiet. His small apartment was little more than a place to shower and rest for a few hours before the alarm rang again. At the repair shop, Mr. Calder noticed the exhaustion growing deeper in Adrian's face. One morning, while Adrian was tightening bolts under the hood of a car, the older man leaned against the tool cabinet and watched him for a moment. "You ever take a day off?" he asked. Adrian gave a tired smile without looking up. "Days off cost money." Mr. Calder shook his head slowly. "You're going to burn yourself out." Adrian wiped his hands with a rag. "Not before the debt's gone." The older man didn't reply. He had heard that answer many times. Across town, life looked very different for someone else connected to Adrian's past. Lila Grant, the woman Adrian had once been married to, lived in a modern apartment building with tall glass windows and a view of the city lights. Music often played in the background of her home, and visitors came and went almost every weekend. On one Friday evening, she sat in a restaurant lounge with several friends around a large table. The place was filled with soft music and laughter. Glasses clinked together as people shared stories from their week. One of her friends leaned forward with a curious smile. "So, tell us again the woman said. Your ex is still paying those debts. Lila took a slow sip from her drink and leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the attention. Oh, he's still paying, she said casually. Another friend raised an eyebrow. Seriously? After the divorce? She laughed lightly. Of course. Adrian always had that problem. What problem? Someone asked. Being too responsible, she replied with a small shrug. The table burst into laughter. He used to say his name meant everything, she continued. So now he's out there working nonstop just to keep everything clean. One man at the table chuckled. So he's basically doing all the work while you move on? Lila lifted her glass again. Pretty much, she said. I guess you could say I had the world's most loyal personal worker. Another wave of laughter spread around the table. None of them noticed a delivery driver standing just outside the partially open door to the lounge. Adrian had arrived at the restaurant with a food delivery order for one of the nearby tables. The hostess had asked him to wait for a moment while she confirmed the order. That was when he heard the voice. At first, he thought he had imagined it, but then the words became clearer. The laughter, the familiar tone. Adrian stood still in the hallway, holding the delivery bag in his hands. Every sentence drifted out through the open doorway. Still paying everything. Too responsible. My personal worker. The words felt strangely distant, like echoes bouncing off walls. For a moment, Adrian wondered if he should simply leave, but his feet didn't move. Inside the lounge, the conversation continued. One of the friends leaned closer to Lila. You're lucky, the woman said. Most people would have walked away from all that. Lila shrugged again. He never would, she replied. He's predictable. What do you mean? He always thinks hard work solves everything. The group laughed again. Outside the door, Adrian stared down at the floor. His first feeling wasn't anger. It was something quieter, something heavier. For the last 2 years, he had believed he was protecting something important. He thought he was preserving his integrity, making sure that mistakes from the past didn't follow him forever. But hearing those words changed something. Not because of the insults, not even because of the laughter. It was the way she spoke about him, as if he were nothing more than a convenient tool. A stranger stepped into the hallway and interrupted his thoughts. Delivery for table 12? The man asked. Adrian blinked and nodded. He walked inside the restaurant dining area and handed the food to the correct customer. The exchange took less than 30 seconds. When he stepped back outside, the cool night air felt sharp against his face. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the noise of the restaurant fade behind him. Cars passed slowly along the street. A group of people walked by, laughing about something on a phone screen. Life moved normally around him, but Adrian felt as if something inside his mind had shifted. During the drive to his next delivery, the words replayed again and again. Personal worker. Predictable. He'll keep paying. For 2 years, Adrian had carried every bill like it was a weight tied directly to his identity. But that night a question finally appeared in his mind. What if some of that weight never belonged to him? He had never truly stopped to ask. He had simply accepted it. By the time Adrian finished the delivery shift and arrived at the grocery store for his evening job, the thought was still there. Boxes stacked around him as he worked in the storage room. His body moved through the same routine as always, lifting, carrying, organizing. But his mind was somewhere else. During a short break, he sat on an empty crate and pulled out his phone. He opened a photo of a folder stored in his apartment. It contained copies of every bill connected to the debt. Something about those papers had always bothered him, but he had ignored the feeling. Now the doubt returned. One of his co-workers noticed his serious expression. You look like you're solving a puzzle, the man joked. Adrian gave a small nod. Maybe I am. The co-worker laughed and returned to work, not realizing how serious the comment actually was. Later that night, while Adrian cleaned offices with the night crew, he moved through the quiet building with slower steps. Desks were lined with computers left in sleep mode. Papers sat neatly stacked where workers had left them earlier in the evening. Most people in the city had gone home hours ago. Adrian wiped the glass wall and stared at his reflection. He looked exhausted, but he also looked different than he had earlier that day. For the first time in a long while, something other than survival filled his mind. Curiosity. when his shift ended close to midnight. Adrian drove home without turning on the radio. The city lights blurred past his windows. Inside his apartment, he didn't immediately go to bed. Instead, he walked straight to the kitchen table and pulled out the thick folder of documents. Stacks of papers spread across the surface. Loan agreements, credit card statements, collection notices. For 2 years, he had simply checked the balances and sent payments. But tonight, he began reading carefully, line by line, date by date. His tired eyes scanned the numbers slowly. The more he looked, the more questions appeared. Some transactions had happened after the divorce was finalized. Some accounts had been opened using information that only a few people would know. Adrian leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. A quiet realization settled over him. Maybe the story he had believed for 2 years wasn't the whole truth. The clock on the wall showed 2:18 a.m. His alarm would ring again in less than 2 hours. Normally, he would already be asleep, but Adrian didn't feel tired anymore. He gathered the papers into neat stacks and placed them back into the folder. For the first time in a long while, the path ahead didn't feel like a straight line of endless work. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. And Adrian Cole had just begun to wonder if the burden he carried had been built on something far more complicated than simple responsibility. The next morning felt different. Even though Adrian's routine looked exactly the same from the outside, the alarm rang at 4:10 a.m. He got out of bed, washed his face, and stepped outside into the quiet street, just like he had done for the past 2 years. The bus arrived. The repair shop opened. Engines were lifted. Tires were changed, and tools clanged against metal. But inside Adrian's mind, something had shifted. The questions from the night before were still there. As he worked on a pickup truck in the garage, he kept remembering the papers spread across his kitchen table. The dates, the strange transactions, the accounts he didn't remember opening. Around mid-morning, Mr. Calder noticed Adrian staring at a receipt instead of the engine in front of him. "You planning to fix the truck or marry it?" the older man joked. Adrian blinked and set the paper down. "Sorry," he said. Mr. Calder studied him for a moment. "Something on your mind?" Adrian hesitated. For 2 years, he had never really talked about the debt with anyone. He always brushed the subject aside. But today, he felt different. "Can I ask you something?" Adrian said quietly, "Of course. If someone used your name to open accounts after a divorce, what would you do?" Mr. Calder's expression changed immediately. "I'd talk to a lawyer," he answered without hesitation. Adrian wiped his hands slowly. "What if you already paid most of it?" "That doesn't change the truth," the older man said. "If something isn't yours, it isn't yours." Those words stayed in Adrian's head for the rest of the day. After finishing his shift at the repair shop, he didn't go straight to the sandwich delivery job like usual. Instead, he walked into a small office building 2 blocks away. A sign near the entrance read, "Community Financial Guidance Center." Adrian had passed the building many times before, but never stepped inside. The waiting room was quiet. A few chairs lined the wall, and a coffee machine hummed softly in the corner. A receptionist looked up with a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" Adrian held the folder of documents tightly. "I think I need advice about some debts." She nodded and asked him to wait. About 15 minutes later, a middle-aged advisor invited him into a small office. The man listened carefully as Adrian explained everything. The divorce, the debts, the 5 jobs, the payments he had been making for 2 years. When Adrian finished speaking, the advisor leaned back in his chair. "You've been carrying a heavy load," he said calmly. Adrian gave a small shrug. "I thought it was my responsibility." The advisor opened the folder and began looking through the documents. Minutes passed as he studied the pages. Finally, he looked up. "Did you notice these dates?" he asked. Adrian nodded slowly. "They happened after the divorce." "Yes," the advisor said. Several of these accounts were opened months later. Adrian felt his chest tighten slightly. "So what does that mean?" "It means you shouldn't assume everything here belongs to you." The advisor explained that identity misuse after separation was not uncommon. Sometimes paperwork moved slowly, and sometimes people took advantage of access to personal information. Adrian listened quietly. "So what should I do?" he asked. The advisor closed the folder. "First, you need to speak with a legal professional. And second, stop assuming guilt for every bill with your name on it. Adrian sat in silence for a moment. For 2 years, he believed there were only two choices: keep paying or destroy his credit by walking away. But now a third possibility appeared: find the truth. That afternoon, he returned to the sandwich shop and completed his deliveries like usual. But his mind felt clearer than it had in a long time. Each address, each order, each street corner passed quickly as he thought about the next step. By evening, Adrian made another decision. He would not keep living exactly the same way. At the grocery store, while stacking boxes in the storage room, he approached the manager during a quiet moment. "Can I talk to you for a second?" he asked. "Sure. I might need to adjust my hours soon." The manager looked surprised. "You're one of our hardest workers," she said. "Everything okay?" "I think so," Adrian replied. "I just need time to sort some things out." Later that night, while cleaning the office building with the night crew, Adrian moved through the quiet hallways thinking about the last 2 years of his life. He had worked nearly every hour of every day. He had ignored birthdays, holidays, and invitations from friends, all because he believed he was fixing something that had been broken. But now, he wondered if the story had been different all along. Around midnight, after finishing the cleaning shift, Adrian drove home again. Instead of collapsing straight into bed, he opened his laptop on the kitchen table. He searched for legal aid services in the city. Within an hour, he had scheduled a consultation for later that week. The appointment confirmation email sat glowing on the screen. Adrian stared at it for a long time. Taking this step felt strange, not because it was wrong, but because it meant he was finally questioning something he had accepted for years. Before going to bed, he returned the documents to the folder and placed it carefully beside the laptop. The alarm rang again at 4:10 the next morning, but something inside Adrian felt lighter. The workday passed quickly, and when Thursday arrived, Adrian walked into a small law office downtown. The lawyer he met was calm and direct. She asked many questions and reviewed the documents carefully. Nearly 40 minutes passed before she spoke. "Several of these debts look suspicious," she said. Adrian leaned forward slightly. "In what way?" "The timing," she explained, "and some of the signatures appear inconsistent." She pointed to a few forms. "These may have been opened using your personal information without your direct approval." Adrian felt a mix of shock and relief. "So what happens now?" "We investigate," she replied. The lawyer explained the process: document reviews, credit reports, and possible legal filings. It would take time. But for the first time in 2 years, Adrian wasn't just reacting to the past. He was actively searching for the truth. That night, when Adrian returned home after his shifts, he looked around his small apartment. The same quiet walls, the same old kitchen table, the same folder of documents. But everything felt slightly different, because now the story of his life was no longer only about survival. It was about understanding what had really happened. Adrian sat down, set his alarm for the next morning, and turned off the light. As he lay in bed, he thought about the moment outside the restaurant when he overheard the conversation that changed everything. At the time, it felt painful. Now it felt like a strange kind of wake-up call. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly, not with loud arguments or dramatic moments. Just a simple sentence overheard through a half-open door. And for Adrian Cole, that moment had finally pushed him to ask a question he should have asked a long time ago. Was he truly responsible for all the weight he had been carrying? Or had he been fighting a battle that was never meant to be his? The answer was still ahead. But for the first time in years, Adrian was finally walking toward it. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest Adrian had experienced in years. His life still involved early mornings, long shifts, and late nights, but there was a quiet change in the way he carried himself. The heavy feeling that had once followed him everywhere was slowly turning into something else. Focus. He continued working at the repair shop every morning. The smell of oil and metal still filled the air as engines roared and tools clattered across the garage floor. But now, instead of thinking only about the next payment he needed to make, Adrian found himself thinking about the investigation that had begun. The lawyer he met had requested copies of all his credit reports, old bank statements, and the divorce paperwork. Adrian spent several evenings gathering everything. His small kitchen table once again became covered with papers. One night, Mr. Calder noticed Adrian leaving the shop a little later than usual. "You look busy these days," the older man said while locking the garage door. Adrian held a folder under his arm, just sorting through old documents. Mr. Calder gave a knowing nod. Sometimes the past hides things in small print. Adrian smiled slightly. That sentence felt truer than ever. A few days later, Adrian received a call from his lawyer while he was in the middle of delivering sandwiches across town. He parked the car near a quiet sidewalk before answering. "We started reviewing the records," the lawyer explained calmly, "and there are several things that don't match." Adrian leaned back in his seat. "What kind of things?" "Accounts opened after the divorce date. Payment requests sent to your old address, but not your new one. And a few applications that appear to use a digital signature that may not belong to you." Adrian didn't speak for a moment. "So what does that mean?" "It means we're filing a formal dispute with the credit agencies," she said, "and possibly requesting an investigation." The word investigation sounded serious, but Adrian didn't feel afraid. Instead, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief. For 2 years, he had been running forward without stopping to ask if the path made sense. Now, someone else was finally examining the road behind him. Later that week, Adrian made a decision that surprised even himself. He quit one of his 5 jobs. It wasn't a repair shop. That job meant too much to him. And it wasn't a sandwich delivery job, which still helped with daily expenses. Instead, he left a late-night construction unloading work. The team leader looked confused when Adrian told him, "You're the hardest worker here." The man said, "You sure about this?" Adrian nodded. "I just need a little time back." Walking to his car that night felt strange. For 2 years, every hour had been planned. Every shift had been necessary. Now, for the first time, Adrian had a few extra hours in the evening. At first, he didn't know what to do with them. He used some of that time to organize his financial records more carefully. Other evenings, he simply sat quietly and allowed himself to rest. His body slowly began recovering from the constant exhaustion. But while Adrian's life was becoming calmer, things were beginning to shift somewhere else. Across the city, Lila's world continued as usual for a while. Her social circle still met in restaurants and bars. Conversations still filled the air with laughter and gossip, but rumors traveled quickly in close groups. One evening, during another gathering, one of her friends mentioned something unexpected. "I heard your ex filed some kind of dispute about the debts," the woman said casually while scrolling through her phone. Lila's smile faded slightly. "What dispute?" "Something about account investigations," the friend replied. "My cousin works at a bank and mentioned it." Lila set her glass down slowly. "That's ridiculous," she said with a forced laugh. But the thought lingered in her mind long after the conversation moved on. Meanwhile, Adrian received another call from his lawyer. This time the news was even clearer. "We found evidence suggesting several accounts were opened using your identity after divorce," she explained. "We've submitted documentation to challenge those debts." Adrian sat quietly in his apartment while listening. "So what happens now?" "Credit agencies will review the evidence. If they confirm the accounts weren't authorized by you, those debts could be removed from your record." Adrian leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. For 2 years, he had believed he owed everything. Now the possibility existed that much of the burden might disappear. But the lawyer added something important. "This process takes time," she said, "and sometimes it becomes complicated." Adrian understood. Nothing important ever moved quickly. Over the next month, letters began arriving at his apartment. Official envelopes from credit agencies, requests for additional documentation, forms asking him to confirm details about the accounts. Adrian filled out every page carefully. For once, the paperwork felt like progress instead of punishment. At the repair shop, Mr. Calder noticed a change. "You look less tired lately," the older man said one morning while handing Adrian a wrench. Adrian chuckled softly. "I quit one job." "Only one." Mr. Calder laughed. "That's still impressive." Adrian shrugged. "I'm learning something." "What's that?" that working nonstop doesn't always fix the real problem. The older man nodded slowly. That's a lesson many people learn too late. One evening, after finishing his shift at the grocery store, Adrian walked home instead of taking the bus. The air was cool and the streets were calm. He realized something surprising during that walk. For the first time in 2 years, his life no longer felt like an endless tunnel. There was space ahead, possibilities. Even small ones felt important. But the biggest change came 3 weeks later. Adrian opened his mailbox and found a thick envelope waiting for him. The return address belonged to one of the credit agencies, reviewing his case. He carried the envelope upstairs and sat at the kitchen table before opening it. His hands moved slowly as he unfolded the papers. The letter explained that several dispute accounts had been reviewed and removed from his financial record due to insufficient evidence linking them to him. Adrian read the sentence 3 times. Removed. Just like that, thousands of dollars of debt disappeared. He sat quietly for a long moment. 2 years of stress. 2 years of exhaustion. 2 years of believing every bill was his responsibility. And now part of that weight was gone. Not because he worked harder, but because he finally asked the right questions. Adrian placed the letter carefully beside the folder of documents. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Outside the apartment window, the city lights flickered softly. For the first time in a very long while, Adrian allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't controlled by endless payments and sleepless nights. But the story wasn't finished yet, because the truth had only begun to surface. And the next chapters of that truth would affect more than just Adrian's life. Life did not suddenly become perfect for Adrian after the first debts were removed. But something important had changed. The weight on his shoulders was lighter, and for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe a little deeper. He still woke up early every morning. The alarm still rang before sunrise, and the repair shop still opened its garage doors at the same time each day. Engines still needed fixing, and cars still rolled in one after another. But Adrian no longer felt like he was running from something. Now he was moving toward something. A few weeks after receiving the first letter from the credit agency, another envelope arrived. Adrian sat at the kitchen table and opened it slowly, just like he had done before. This letter confirmed what his lawyer had suspected. More accounts had been removed from his record. The investigation had shown that several credit applications were submitted after the divorce using personal information connected to Adrian, but without clear proof that he had authorized them. The companies involved decided to close those accounts. Adrian placed the letter down on the table and stared at it quietly. The room was silent, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. For 2 years, he had believed he owed every dollar. He had punished himself with endless work because he thought it was the only honorable choice. Now the truth was clearer. Some of the burden he carried had never belonged to him. That evening, Adrian called his lawyer to thank her for the help. "You did the hard part yourself," she told him. "You kept records, you stayed organized, and you were willing to ask questions." Adrian gave a small laugh. "I wish I'd asked those questions earlier. That happens to a lot of people," she replied. "Responsibility is a good quality, but it should never blind you from the truth." After ending the call, Adrian sat quietly for a while. He thought about the long nights he had spent lifting boxes, cleaning offices, and driving across the city with tired eyes. Part of him felt frustrated about those lost hours. But another part of him understood something important. Those years had changed him. They had shown him how strong he could be. At the repair shop the next morning, Mr. Calder noticed Adrian looking unusually calm. "You win a lottery or something?" the older man joked. Adrian shook his head. "Not exactly." But a few more debts disappeared. Mr. Calder let out a low whistle. "That's good news." Adrian nodded. "Better than good." The old mechanic leaned against the workbench. "So what are you going to do now? Work only 4 jobs instead of 5. Adrian laughed. "Actually, I'm thinking about working fewer." Mr. Calder smiled in approval. "That sounds like a smart plan." Over the next month, Adrian made several changes to his life. He quit another late-night job and focused mostly on the repair shop and the delivery work. His body slowly began to recover from years of exhaustion. He started sleeping more than 3 hours a night. He even began cooking simple meals at home instead of grabbing cheap food between shifts. These changes might have seemed small to someone else, but to Adrian, they felt like major victories. One evening after work, he took a long walk through a nearby park. The sun was setting, and families were sitting on benches while children played nearby. Adrian watched the scene quietly. For 2 years, he had rarely slowed down long enough to notice moments like this. Now he realized how much of life he had missed while trying to fix the past. But the biggest surprise came one afternoon when his phone rang during a break at the repair shop. The number looked unfamiliar. Adrian stepped outside to answer. The voice on the other end belonged to Lila. He hadn't heard from her in a very long time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she cleared her throat. "I heard about the investigation," she said carefully. Adrian leaned against the wall of the garage. "Yeah." Another pause followed. "I didn't think you would actually challenge the debts," she admitted. Adrian looked down at the pavement. "Neither did I," he said honestly. Her voice sounded less confident than it once had. "Well, things have been complicated lately," she said. Adrian didn't ask what she meant. He had spent too many years worrying about problems that weren't his. Finally, she spoke again. "I guess I just wanted to say, I didn't expect things to turn out like this." Adrian thought about the night outside the restaurant when he had overheard her laughing with friends. For a moment, he considered mentioning it, but then he realized something. He didn't need that conversation anymore. "Life surprises people sometimes," he said calmly. There was another long pause on the line. "Are you angry?" she asked quietly. Adrian thought about the question. 2 years earlier, the answer might have been yes. But now he felt something different. "No," he replied. "Why not?" "Because I finally stopped carrying things that weren't mine." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then she simply said goodbye and ended the call. Adrian slipped his phone back into his pocket and returned to the garage. Mr. Calder noticed him walking back inside. "Everything all right?" the older man asked. Adrian picked up a wrench and nodded. "Yeah," he said, "everything's all right." The months continued to pass. Adrian's life slowly found a healthier rhythm. He worked hard at the repair shop, saved money, and gradually rebuilt his credit record. The folder of old debt papers remained in a drawer in his apartment, but he rarely needed to open it anymore. Instead, new plans began taking shape. One evening, Mr. Calder called Adrian into the small office behind the garage. "I've been thinking," the older man said while pouring 2 cups of coffee. Adrian sat down. "You've been running this place with me for years," Mr. Calder continued, "and I'm not getting any younger." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time I start training someone to take over someday." Adrian blinked in surprise. "Me?" Mr. Calder smiled. "You already do have to work around here." Adrian didn't answer right away. The idea felt almost unreal. For so long his life had been about surviving one day at a time. Now someone was talking about the future. A real future. When Adrian walked home that night, the city lights looked brighter than usual. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The long nights. The endless work. The moment outside the restaurant that changed everything. Sometimes the hardest part of life isn't working hard. It's realizing when you've been fighting the wrong battle. Adrian had spent 2 years believing he had to carry every burden placed in front of him. Now he understood something better. Strength isn't just about endurance. It's also about knowing when to question the weight you're carrying. When Adrian reached his apartment, he looked around the small room with quiet appreciation. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't big, but it was peaceful. He set his alarm for the next morning, just like always, for 10 a.m. But this time, the alarm didn't feel like a warning that another exhausting day was coming. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a life that finally belonged to him.